Hello everyone, it's Martin, aka Anders, and by God, we actually have a tournament to talk about. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at the NSG x Renegades Invitational, a tournament that by most assessments kind of shattered a lot of people's preconceived notions about the gap between NA's Tier 1 and Tier 2s for Valorant, and served as a phenomenal prelude moving into First Strike, where, as I'm sure we're all aware at this point, there are no invite slots. Let's jump right into it. The Renegades Invitational was a 16-team North American tournament where 4 of those slots were allocated to play-ins through 2 qualifiers. The remaining 12 invite slots were allocated to the usual suspects, with a couple names conspicuously missing, among them TSM, for reasons unknown, Sentinels, likely because of Sinatra's recent eye injury, and 100 Thieves because they only recently moved their roster with Asuna and Dicey included. The tournament's early stages played out across 4 different groups, and much to some people's surprise, some of the qualification teams upset established Tier 1 organizations to make their way into the playoffs. The first of these was Mamba Mode Gaming, who came out on top of both Space Station and Luminosity, and the second was Moon Raccoons, who actually pushed Renegades to the bottom of the group in their own tournament. From there, the playoffs bracket took on an interesting dimension, with the top half hosting all 3 of the relatively unknown teams in Moon Raccoon's Andbox and Mamba mode, the 4th slot in that top half being held by Gen G, whereas the bottom half hosted all of the Tier 1 staples, FaZe, Cloud9, T1, and Immortals. The quarterfinal shook out with Moon Raccoons taking a stunning 2-0 upset over Gen G, Andbox 2-0ing Mamba, Cloud9 2-0ing FaZe, and Immortals 2-0ing T1. Semifinals followed with Andbox 2-1ing Moon Raccoons, ending their fairy tale run, Immortals 2-1ing Cloud9, and thus moving Andbox and Immortals to the final. If you were to have polled 20 top-tier North American analysts on who they thought would have made it through to this final, I would bet my bottom dollar that this is what none of them would have come up with. A new Immortals roster, after they've shed the majority of their players, making it immediately to a final, and Andbox, who comes in as a predominantly unknown quantity, really put a shock on a lot of people's faces. Andbox ended up taking this final in 2-0 fashion, proving that although they were mostly unknown before this, they sure as hell won't be anymore. From here, I'm going to fall into my normal pattern of how I look at these tournaments, taking a jab at all of the different stats, and then I'm going to take a look at some of the strategy utilized by Andbox and how I think they managed to sort of run away with this event. First, let's jump right into the maps. Taking a look at the map pick statistics, it's exactly what we've come to expect. If you compare this to Pop Flash, what was effectively the most recent high-profile North American event prior to this, it's an exact mirror. You're going to have Ascent and Haven at the top of the totem pole, with Split and Bind trailing significantly. The way those numbers specifically hash out being Ascent and Haven with roughly a third of all maps played each, and the remaining third split 20-14 between Bind and Split, respectively. Looking at map biases, again, it's mostly what we'd expect, with defensive bias on Split and Ascent, offensive bias on Haven. What's a little bit up in the air, though, is how Bind shook out here. If we go back to Pop Flash, Bind actually had a Haven-like offensive skew on it, and in this event we see a polar flip of that to where it was the most defensive map of the tournament. This number might be a little fudged due to the fact that it was a slightly lower pick rate than both Ascent and Haven, meaning that this is more subject to variance, but even so, it's worth pointing out. With maps out of the way, let's hop over to Agent Stats. As you can surely tell, Agent Stats have a bit of a new look. Would love your guys' thoughts down in the comments below if you like this new style or if you prefer the way that I've handled it previously. Looking at mixing things up a little bit and making this information a little bit more valuable on your guys' end. One of the biggest pieces of feedback I've received in the past is your guys' interest towards map-specific statistics on certain agents, and so this is my attempt at trying to integrate that. Like I said, let me know down below. To give you a lay of the land, the agent portraits on the left-hand side are the top-to-bottom rankings of pick rate, and the portraits on the right-hand side are top-to-bottom rankings of win rate. I'm going to be going top-to-bottom based off of pick rate and discussing each agent in turn. First off, we have Omen because he boasted a literal 100% pick rate. This isn't being reported the same by sites like VLR because they included the qualifiers statistics in their overall event stats. If you're looking at just the final event of itself, the group stage and playoff bracket of the Invitational, Omen was picked in every single map by every single team. Because of that 100% pick rate, he's forced to an automatic 50% win rate, and his top picked map and top win map are completely irrelevant. Next up, we have Jet coming in at just under 78% pick rate. Her most picked map was Ascent at just north of 90% pick rate, an absolute obscene stat for that map in particular, with an overall win rate of just over 51% and a top map performance of Bind with just under 53%. These stats all check out and mostly correlate to her inclusion in the most prevalent standard meta composition, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. After her, we have Sova, who boasts a very similar level of map specialization. He saw a just under 77% pick rate, but with a 95% pick rate on Bind, a sub 50% win rate at 49 flat, and a Bind-specific win rate of just over 49%. Cypher comes through with a similar situation to Sova, with a slightly lower pick rate just below 75%, a mirrored 95% pick rate on Bind, a slightly higher win rate at just over 50% overall, and a 52% or so win rate on Ascent, which was his best map throughout the tournament. From here, pick rates take an absolute nosedive. We're talking about Omen with 100, Jet with almost 80, Sova and Cypher with functionally 75, and Reyna with 50 at the 5th slot. Her most picked map came in at a dead heat tie between Ascent and Haven at just under 59.5%. Her win rate, however, came in cloned with Sova at 49 even, and her top performing map was Split with an almost 54% win rate, but the sample size for her specifically on Split was so little that this is pure team-specific variance. Moving on, the nosedive continues. We go from 100 to mid-70s to 50, and now we're all the way down to almost 33 for Breach. His top picked map was Split with just under 71.5%. He comes in, again, with that now highly recurring 49% flat win rate, and his top performing map was Bind with just over 54.5%. As a quick aside, there's a lot of reasoning behind why these top picked maps and top win maps are the ones that they are in most of these cases. The only reason I'm glossing over it in this video in particular is because I want to allocate such a large chunk of time to analyzing Andbox later on. I just wanted to put that out there and make sure that you guys know I'm not just flying over these willy-nilly. Next up, we have Phoenix, who comes in at a roughly 30% pick rate, with his top map being Bind at double his overall pick rate, coming in at 60 flat. His overall win rate just over 50%, and his top win map is also his most picked, with Bind at 54%. Coming in after Phoenix, we have Raze at just under 29% overall pick rate. Despite that, she boasts the third highest map-specific pick rate of any agent on any map in this tournament at just under 93% on Split. Obviously, Split was played far less, so this is going to be an easier stat to achieve, but nonetheless, it is very clear how heavily teams prefer to have Raze in their composition on that map. Her win rate also comes in fairly high relative to the ones that we've been looking at most recently, at just under 51%, and her top performing map is Haven at almost 58%, which is absolutely astronomical until you realize that the only time she was played on that map was by C9, and they were crushing their opponents when it happened. After Raze, we have Killjoy at 26.5%, with her top picked map being unsurprisingly Ascent at 40.6%, her win rate coming in at that freakishly recurring 49%, and her top win map, Haven, at 52. Next up, and technically last, we have Viper at 4% pick rate overall. Interestingly, she was picked over a quarter of the time on Split, but also, she was only picked on Split. These are less Viper stats and more Viper on Split stats. She was played there by Andbox repeatedly, and we'll get into that shortly. But, just as a primer, she boasted an incredible 55.6% win rate on the map. That brings us to the final two, and the reason they're the final two is because they weren't picked at all. Again, this is going to rub up against stats on sites like VLR that are including qualifiers in their statistics because Brim was played during one of the qualifiers, but if you look at the event proper, neither of these agents appeared a single time. If we drop everything out, here's what the lay of the land looked like overall for pick rate top to bottom and win rate top to bottom. Moving straight into compositions, there's only one I really want to talk about, and I'm going to be honest, it's not for a good reason. The compositional core of Cypher, Jet, Omen, and Sova was overwhelmingly dominant in this event. It's really just a case of plug and play your preferred duelist with flashes and go from there. Plugging in just the flash-wielding duelist variants of this composition, filling the 5th slot with Breach, Phoenix, or Reyna, you can account for well north of a third of all compositions played in this event, creeping up towards 45%. In fact, when you start looking at it on a map-by-map basis, on Ascent, compositions of this archetype occurred almost 60% of the time. I'll readily concede that it's at least in part validated by the fact that there's an almost 52% win rate with it and an almost 54% win rate with it on Bind, but even so, this kind of compositional one-notedness is a massive red flag for me, and I'm going to be pushing out a video soon on exactly why I think that is. The main takeaway I want people to grasp from me bringing this up is that creeping up on half of the entire North American metagame can be summarized with compositional sameness and a complete balance in the utility that both teams have. Whether or not that's healthy is a completely different conversation for a completely different day, but it stands to reason that as of right now, it is a statistical reality. And now we get to the part that was why I've been rushing this entire time. We have got to talk about Andbox. Andbox came into this event as a complete dark horse, and to the surprise of frankly probably everyone, they dropped one singular map to Moon Raccoons the entire tournament from group stage through grand final. There's one recurring theme though in the way that they were playing that I think caught a lot of people off guard. They played a specific composition on a specific map that no one had an answer to. That composition coincidentally was one that could have been copied directly out of my own playbook. Breach, Cypher, Omen, Raze, and Viper as the go-to split composition. If we look at the pick rates of this composition, you'll notice that they mirror those of Viper because this was the only time Viper appeared in the tournament, and it was to absolutely stupendous effect. Andbox played this map and this composition 4 times and didn't drop it once. You want to know a great strategy to make your way through a best of 3 playoff bracket? Force people onto a map you know they're uncomfortable on and take it as a pseudo one-map advantage in every single set, just as Andbox did repeatedly in this tournament. It was a decisive split map 2 against Moon Raccoons that kept them in the series and ultimately gave them the opportunity to come through to the grand final, and it was on split that they nailed close the coffin of Immortals. And so let's get down to the meat and potatoes of it. How the hell did they do it? How did they make this map that everyone loves to hate their own territory? A disclaimer before I hype this up too much, I don't think that this strategy is anything astronomically innovative. I think that they had a prepared strategy for a map that most teams don't have prepared strategies for, and that was the linchpin of this entire operation. You have a lot of analytical content and podcasts where folks are talking about how Split seemed almost offensive-sided when Andbox was playing on it, and yeah, it did, because they were executing on teams that were playing static defaults and using a composition that had Viper and explosive executes, and that's fundamentally going to beat those sort of passive plays 9 times out of 10. Let's look at exactly what I'm talking about and dig a little bit deeper. To kick us off, I actually have an example that in no way goes the way Andbox wants it to, but is a great highlight of how they play this map. They cam out A main, and then Cybercage A main, and then they raise double blast packs into back site. This allows them to get deep control of site typically, but in this situation, everything goes sideways, and the raise dies. The general follow-up, though, is still visible with that poison cloud in the center of site, allowing the team to push up. In this case, though, because they don't have back site control, it all falls apart. If we look at this next example, though, it's an example of how well it can go. We see the same cam go out for A main coverage, the same cyber cage, a breach flash into the front portion of site to blind anyone on heaven, and the raise goes deep. She immediately picks up one and then blasts away a poorly placed Phoenix ultimate. The team plays up site using the poison cloud as cover, and then Omen and Raze push their way through screens into CT to fully wrap the site. In this particular instance, they also have a Viper ultimate at their disposal, and so they pop that on site as well. If we break this down into a slower overhead where I'm not literally play-by-playing it over the live footage, we can see that there's a lot more nuance to the way that they're playing this site. It's the most standard Viper wall that we've seen on Split since literally early beta, but there's a lot more to it from there. We see the Cypher Cam main, then we see the Cyber Cage and the Poison Cloud go out, and then the next step is not only that Breach Flash I mentioned, but they paranoia the entirety of backside. Then the Raze double blast packs in, we see a 2-man split where one goes to hell, the other one goes for assistance in sight, and 2 play sort of a late anchor in A main to prevent any sort of secondary pushes. As those 4 funnel onto site, we have Omen wrapping around the far side of the center site Poison Cloud to meet up with Raze to pinch elbow and screens, while the rest of the team takes post plant positions and really sort of locks down the rest of the site. Next up, we have an example that shows a little bit more multi-dimensionality in that they're pushing B instead of A. Instead of using the Cypher Cam, they use a Boombot to clear out main, and then the enemy Omen was kind enough to dark cover the main entrance for them. The usual play comes out though, where Raze pushes up, double blast packs through whatever smoke is in their way, and clears back site. A little bit of a mixed execution here is that a Breach Flash comes out too late to be relevant, but it's fine. Raze still gets the kill. We grenade towards ropes, and then the Viper Wall goes up, blocking all of the CT entrance as well as Scaffold and Heaven to allow the team to take up post-plant positionings. When we pivot into an overhead view, we see, as was the case in the last one, that there's a little bit more nuance to this play than is immediately apparent. There's a 5-stack outside of B main, and then they push into garage. Presumably, if there isn't already an Omen dark cover blocking B main, they drop one there, and then the Viper Wall goes up. Here's when a little bit more nuance starts coming out though. An Omen Paranoia comes out on the right side of the Viper Wall as the Breach Flash goes into backside and the Raze double blast packs into backside. From there, it's a full clear of sight, and the Omen takes up a post-plant position in ropes, which was cleared by a Raze nade, to smoke off both CT and Heaven to lock down the entirety of sight, and they play a large cluster behind the center site column. Thus far, this has been fairly linear Viper gameplay. You have 5-stack, full committal explosive executes abusing the Viper Wall. And that's not a bad thing. This was very much so a trademark of Anbox's playstyle and was one of the reasons they found so much success. A lot of the standard gameplay in North America right now is running that Cypher, Jet, Omen, Sova, flash-wielding duelist configuration, and the passive op-centric defaults that likes to play a lot of the time really does not do well against vastly coordinated executes around heavy utility like Viper Walls, and so it went their way more often than it didn't, obviously. This next example, though, will show not only how you can do these full committal plays with Viper Walls, but how you can sort of use them cerebrally and outthink your opponents in addition to just brute forcing. Here we see the Viper Wall go down that, if we were using the early examples as precedent, would indicate a full A hit. Instead of that, however, the Viper pivots back towards the B site, and we see a 4-1 split coming through with Cypher taking up the role of flank coverage. Once the round pops off, the Viper Wall goes up, signaling that the team at least has to be somewhat terrified of an A pop coming out. Instead, we see a B execute that is very similar to what we saw in the most recent example. While of course there's going to be a lot more nuance on a round-to-round basis that gives you a general idea of how they were playing their offense, you had full A pops, full B pops, and then sort of A bait B pops, as well as A baits that allowed them to play more passive defaults that would allow them to work more dynamically around double op setups on the defender's side. That leaves us with only one thing left to cover though, and that is exactly that, the defender's side. In this example, we see what was a pretty typical defensive setup out of Anbox. They start with a B main Viper one-way, classic sort of stuff, but they opt for double B Heaven and mailroom coverage and instead completely abandon vents other than a single trapwire in the ropes segment of it. There's also a trapwire that goes down on A ramp, and instead Breach and Cypher on the A site opt to play an aggressive info grab into A main. That allows their team a lot of information to work off of, despite the fact that they're already fighting the opponents in mid, and so they know that it's not any sort of split play towards mid, and those two A players can play more towards a deep defender spawn rotation position. Overall, this is a phenomenal defensive setup and allows for info plays on the far side of the map while you have a strong side on the portion of the map where you're not playing for information. As is seemingly always the case though, when we go to the overhead view, there's a little bit more nuance to this. We see the Viper one way and we see the tripwires, however, from that point, we see a dark cover co-out to immediately disincentivize any sort of B main or garage push, trying to funnel people towards the 2-stack that's covering mid, or towards the A site, which we are going to get early information on. From there, we see Renegades go out in order to stall aggressive 5-man stacks in mid, while that push comes into A main, and then an aggressive rotation comes up from the remaining 2 players if it ends up being a mid to B play. Alright, let's bring it full circle. The NSG Renegades Invitational was a great event and frankly the perfect prelude moving into First Strike. They brought in some of the best teams in North American Tier 2 and proved that even though they're considered Tier 2 widely, they're more than capable of taking maps and even full sets off of some of North America's best. Not only that, but the methods through which they managed to pull it off were far from what we would have necessarily expected and were a little bit of a reality check for a lot of Tier 1 teams. This isn't a situation where you're going to be able to play standard perpetually. You're going to have strategies for every single map and every potential composition that your opponents could throw at you, or they will shut you down. Per the usual, if you guys are enjoying my content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Obviously, I put tons of work into this stuff. Hopefully it comes off that way. And I know that I changed up the format. This is clearly a far cry from what we've been doing for computing competitives in the past, but I wanted to do a little bit of a spin as it's been such a long time since we've had a tournament like this to look at. As always, if you're enjoying this content, you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at AnderzzTV. I tweet pretty frequently actually when it comes to events like this, and I push out information on new videos coming out there on a regular basis, so that's probably one of the best ways to keep in touch. And other than that, as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.